a very short outline of what we're going to be discussing tonight that Dennis is passing around. Go ahead. All right, let's begin with prayer. Father, we thank you for the many blessings that we have. We thank you for the opportunity tonight to come together and to study from your word. And Lord, help us to be able to learn some things tonight that will help us as we talk with other people and as we come to know you and believe in you more. Most of all, Lord, we thank you for your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray, amen. Okay, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to cover 2 chapters in the book. Andy, can I borrow the book for just a minute? I left mine at home. I don't think I'm going to need it, but I want to. Okay. We're going to be covering 2 chapters in the book, Reasons to Believe by Chad Ramsey. And tonight we're going to be looking at 4 very common philosophical arguments for the existence of God. I don't know about y'all, but I have not in my life had very much contact with people that are atheists. I just haven't. I would say probably 99.9% of the people I interact with, at least if I know, they're probably in some form believers in God. I grew up a preacher's child in small towns in West Tennessee and North Mississippi. So I'm in the Bible Belt. And there just weren't that many people that at least acknowledged the fact that they might be atheist or agnostic. I had one friend in high school that said he was an atheist. I think agnostic would probably describe him a little bit better. And that brought a lot of distress to his mom, who was one of the teachers, because she was a church-attending woman. And her son did not believe in God. So that caused her a lot of problems. But I went to Freed-Hardeman. If there were any atheists at Freed-Hardeman, they didn't let it be known. So my first real contact with somebody that was a professed atheist was when I went to grad school at Memphis State, with the University of Memphis now, with Memphis State then. I guess in my mind, I kind of thought that if somebody was an atheist, you'd be able to tell just by looking at them. I don't know why I thought that, but I thought there would be something about them physically or something about them that would just show up that they were not believers in God, but that's not really the case. One thing I thought several times I think is kind of interesting, when there are disasters like the tornadoes we had in our area last year, there's going to be Churches of Christ disaster relief trucks there. There's going to be people from Franklin Graham's group, Samaritans, I think it's called Samaritan's Purse maybe, I can't remember what his group is called, but there will be trucks from different religious organizations that will be there. I'm sure there will be some individual atheists that will be there trying to help out in the recovery. But I don't think there's going to be a truck from the Atheist Disaster Relief Organization. I've never heard of that. I don't think they organize in ways like that, like people that follow God tend to do, or people that are involved in charitable work tend to do. So I kind of think that's interesting. But back to my first instance of being around somebody that's a professed atheist. I had 2 professors at Memphis State that made no bones about the fact that one of them was an atheist, one called himself an agnostic. The one that was an agnostic, he grew up a Catholic in Japan, and he did his dissertation in religious hierarchy, and he just, somewhere along the line, developed a distaste for religion. And he loved to point out hypocrisy that he saw in religion. The other man was I would call him a militant atheist. He tried to impose his views on the students. Now, this is a graduate class, so most of the students were mid-20s and up. But he said some very outlandish things in class. I had him for sociology. It was a sociology of business class, and he said some very outlandish things. And I just thought as he did that, here's a man with a PhD. He's got a really good personality. Has a great lecture style. He's interesting. If an 18-year-old comes in here and listens to this man, they might believe some of this stuff he's saying. And that's really scary when we think about the things that a lot of young people are exposed to. On the first day that I was in his class, he mentioned he didn't mention he was an atheist the first day of the whole class. I'll tell you how I found out he was an atheist. He talked about his background, and he said he grew up in Henderson, Tennessee, And he said he had an undergraduate degree from Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Well, had graduated from Freed-Hardeman. I'd started teaching at Lipscomb. I was working on my master's, so I would go back and live with my parents in the summer. And I commuted with a few people from my hometown in West Tennessee, a little town called Ripley. It's about an hour north of Memphis. I commuted back 5 days a week. There were 4 of us, my high school math teacher and 2 of my high school football coaches and me. We commuted back and forth to Memphis. And my 2 high school football coaches that were in the group, we were all in the same class with this teacher. They were both very active members of the First Baptist Church in Ripley. They were both deacons in the First Baptist Church. So when the teacher said that he had a graduate degree from Union University, that kind of piqued their interest. When he said he grew up in Henderson, Tennessee, where Freed-Hardeman is, that kind of piqued mine. So all 3 of us had the same idea. We're going to get in good with this teacher here on the first day. So we went up to talk to him, and I said, I went to school at Freed-Hardeman University. And my 2 coaches said, we're members of the First Baptist Church in Ripley. The president of Union University has spoken at our congregation the last 2 weeks while our preacher's been out of town. We think we're going to get brownie points. And he looked at all 3 of us and said, I'm an atheist. I have no use for either one of those institutions. So pretty much off the bat, we found out that that wasn't going to be impressive to him, the things that we had that we thought were a connection. But to his credit, he didn't treat us differently because of that. I thought he treated us fairly. Most of the people in class never objected to some of the outlandish things he said. But there were 4 of us in the class that would push back sometimes. The 3 of us, and there was one other man in the class that would push back. One of the most outlandish things he did one day was he tried to make the case that adultery was healthy for a relationship. And there were people in the class that just sat there. And one guy sat there, well, I've never really thought about it like that, but maybe you've got a point, because he went through several reasons. I don't remember what the reasons were, but maybe you have a point there. And, we were like, no. What about the oath that you took to be faithful and those things? And the teacher said, I don't believe in any absolutes. I don't believe that there's a moral authority, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think the teacher probably would have had a different opinion if we decided on the first exam that we're going to steal the key or we're all going to collaborate and share answers. I think he might have had a moral line there, but he didn't see moral lines in a lot of things, and he was very much a situation ethics guy. But here's one thing that I thought was interesting. This is probably the thing I remember most from that class, which was 40 years ago. One day we got to class, and he went up to the older one of the 3 of us, who had been my head coach in high school, and said, would you mind stopping by my office after class? I've got something I need to talk with you about. So we all had another class 5 minutes after that one ended. So we go to class without him. He says, I'll meet you all in class. He never shows up in class. And we're all riding together, so we go back to the car and wait on him. And when he gets there, because of confidentiality, he wouldn't let us in on what the whole conversation was. But here's what he said about the conversation. He said, y'all need to pray for, and he named the professor. His marriage is in shambles. He's desperate. He has nobody to turn to and nobody to confide in. So here's a man who doesn't believe in God. And when he's facing a big crisis in his life, he turns to someone who has challenged him in class, and he knows this guy has a strong faith. And that's who he turned to for advice. I think that's pretty significant. The other teacher I had, I guess it's not politically correct to talk like he does. He was from Japan. He spoke in broken English, but he loved to bring out things that he saw in religion that he felt were hypocritical. And one day he's in class, and he starts in on the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Convention. He called the head of the Southern Baptist Convention the Baptist Pope. And he's just going on and on and on about the Baptist Pope. So I kind of elbow one of my coaches and just look at him and smile. And the professor looks at me and says, Mr. Taylor, why are you smiling? Your Church of Christ claims to be completely autonomous. That's not true. The president of Harding University is the true head of the Church of Christ. So, then they're laughing at me. Well, a few years later, when Neil and Clint Anderson started going here, I shared that story with Neil Anderson. And I said, Brother Anderson, I didn't know that Cliff Gaines had that much power. I always kind of thought you were the head of the Church of Christ, being the gospel advocate. But anyway, both of those men seemed to respect the fact that we didn't just go along with everything they said. Because I was kind of afraid if I say my true feelings, I'm going to make an F in this class, but it really wasn't the case. I've heard of that happening, but that wasn't the case with them. Okay, we're going to look at 4 philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And I've got a scripture reference, or many I could use a scripture reference each one of these, but one thing I want to make sure I point out is if you're talking about the existence of God with somebody that doesn't believe in God, you can have 1,000 scriptures, it's not going to make any difference because they're not going to accept it. Even if you get into scriptures that show the historical accuracy of the Bible, and there's no way to explain that other than the Bible was given by somebody that had a knowledge that humans can't possibly have. And we'll talk about some of those things later in the book. But even if you get into that point, it's not going to help you with these arguments about the existence of God. So we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible. I grew up in North Mississippi and West Tennessee, so I got to keep it simple. The only foreign language I ever took was English in Mississippi. And I never had to take Spanish or French or anything like that. So we're going to try to keep this simple. But the first argument that I'm going to present to you is called the Cosmological Argument. And kind of the premise of that is there has to be a cause and effect. Would someone turn and read Romans 1, 18 through 21? Okay? Go ahead, Andy.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened.
Okay, I think one of the things that Paul is pointing out here is, even if you have never heard of God, there's evidence all around that there must be some God. Even people that have never heard the gospel, especially if we look back in history, they came up with their own explanations for things, and it usually involves some kind of deity. Usually it was a false god, but they came up with some kind of explanation for things that they saw because they understood there's got to be a cause and effect. I was a part of a Bible study last night with some friends of mine, and the person presented it was talking. We weren't talking about this subject. He was talking about God, and he just talked about if we look at everything we see in the universe, how can you not believe there's a God? And he said it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. There's a huge leap of faith you've got to take if you think all this just happened by chance. So there's got to be a cause and effect. Now, there is a website. When I was trying to come up with simple summaries on this, I found a website that had simple summaries on all this. It was a website called Reason and Meaning, but the website is a website that's dedicated to destroying Christianity. But they had a really good summary because what they spent after they summarized it, they spent time looking at all the reasons why this argument is not true and this argument can be defeated, blah, 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 like that. But they had a really good summary. So here's the summary they gave on that website of the cosmological argument. Number 1, everything has a cause. Number 2, causes can't just be traced back to infinity. Third, there had to have been a first cause for the existence of the world. Then that leads to number 4. Therefore, there must be an infinite creator. And the conclusion is the cause of all things must be God. Now, I can see some logic in this argument. What do you think are some strengths and maybe weaknesses of the cosmological argument? Again, I know it's not spelled the same, it doesn't mean this, but when I think cosmological, I think cause. Okay, there is a cause to what we have in the world today and in the universe today. Anybody think of any strengths or weaknesses that this argument might have?
To some degree, you can always come back to, if you're you're speaking with somebody who argues against these points, oftentimes they're going to come back with something that you can easily say, and where did that come from? And how did that get there? They're utilizing things that happen, for example, in Big Bang. They're utilizing things that happen, but if you just ask, okay, so where did that come from? So where did that come from? So they eventually don't have anything left.
Yes.
And these four give you an opportunity to leave the one arguing against them with nothing left.
Okay. That's good. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, and then my daughter asked who created God.
Okay.
Because we went through that argument, and I
Mhm.
said, so when they say, when they keep saying, but then it was this, and then this created this, or this came from this, and she's like, well, then Mom, who created God? If God created everything, and so I was like, well, it's a good question, babe.
Yeah, that is.
You
That
just have
is.
to know that God he's always been there.
And even as an adult, I still grasp sometimes to comprehend the meaning of infinity. I'm a math teacher, so I deal with infinity all the time. But it's still a difficult and complex thing to try to get your mind wrapped around. And I can see how it would really be one for a small child. But if you were talking with an adult, something had to be there. Something had to cause it. And if you do follow the line that Andy talked about, you just keep going back, what caused that, what caused that. At some point, you've got to get back to either saying there's got to be some kind of deity that started, or there was absolutely nothing, and all of a sudden there was something, and all the causes came from that something, and there's no explanation where that came from. Unless you go back to a belief that matter has always been, and which is what a lot of people that have that view think, but there's no explanation for where that came from. So it's again.
There will be people that will believe matter has always been.
Yeah.
They just can't believe that God has always been.
Correct.
Well, why can matter so easily have always been? So matter can't create God, but God could create matter. So.
Yep. Okay. Anything else on cosmological argument?
This doesn't truly avoid the argument who created God, but if you add the word material, everything material has a cause. That makes a
Okay.
distinction, and even science says that everything material has a cause. As I understand.
Okay.
Second law of thermodynamics. No. It's one of their main premises.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, the next one. This one also seems very logical to me. It's called the teleological argument. And that basically is there's design in the world. Would someone else turn and read Psalms 19, 1 and 2, please? Dennis?
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge.
Have you ever had the chance to be out in a night sky away from light pollution? It's incredible. You can see things that you can't see if you walked outside in Nashville. I remember 10 years or so ago that our family was in Arizona and we were at the Grand Canyon. And we went outside. Our kids were, I think, 6th and 8th grade, something like that. We went out in the night sky, and the number of stars you can see is absolutely mind-blowing. And I know Bill in sermons before has talked about all of the different aspects of the universe and how billions and billions of stars, and our sun is like the head of a pin compared to stars in other galaxies, and billions of galaxies, billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of light years between galaxies. I can't even comprehend all that. There's got to be a design. It couldn't have all just come from matter. I mean, I don't understand how you can even believe that. But what David is saying here is the heavens declare the glory of God. If you look up in the sky, how could you not believe there's a God? You know, if you can stand at the ocean and see the power of the ocean, how can you not believe there's a God? I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I have no proof on this. It's just something I read. And you know what? Sometimes you read stuff that's not true. But one scientist said that there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand in all the beaches on Earth. I don't know how you come up with that. But if that's true, I mean, I can't imagine picking up a bucket of sand and going through and trying to count the grains of sand, let alone all the beaches on all the Earth, and there are more stars than that. Well, if there's even a percentage of the stars of that, it's incredible to think about. But the question comes back to, was this all by design, or did it just happen? I know in the sermon I was referring to from Bill, he talked about the tilt of the earth, and if it was off either way, we would either freeze to death or we would burn up. The orbits, all the things that happen, God has put it just the right place to support life. And if things had been off a degree, maybe less than a degree, in any direction, the earth might not be inhabitable by man. And none of the things that we enjoy would be possible. Okay, let's go through just the summary of this one. And this is from Chad Ramsey's book, Reasons to Believe, on page 20. He gives this summary of the meaning of this argument. A, if the world exhibits intelligent design, there must be an intelligent designer. B, the world shows intelligent design. So the conclusion C, therefore an intelligent designer, God, exists. That seems logical to me. But if I didn't believe in God, I've got to come up with some other explanation. And right now, the best explanation that most people that don't believe in God has is it all happened by chance. Again, I think it takes more faith to believe that than it does believe in God. But a person that's an atheist is going to accuse us of being superstitious or naive. They're not going to buy that. Before I move on, does anybody have any thoughts on strengths, weaknesses about the argument of there is design? There has to be a designer because our world shows design.
I know that atheists will go out of their way to either disprove the notion of purpose or the notion of design, and one of those ways is to say that we're made as per our founding or whatever you will. I mean, it even sounds like a designer. The way in which we're in the universe, we are biased towards seeing design where it doesn't exist, which it doesn't really compute, because like when you use an illusion to disprove that I see what's in front of me, people don't say, well, let's cover your eyes throughout your reality so you don't have, or so you're not tricked by illusions. It's kind of like a baby in bathwater type argument you could never live with in the real world.
Okay. Anything else? I know a very common illustration that I've seen people use for design is, what if you just took a lot of things, a lot of little parts, and you put them in a paper sack and you shook it up and you pull out a Rolex watch? Would anybody actually believe that could happen? No. Nobody would believe that happened. That's not as amazing as thinking about the creation of the world from nothing. I mean, that's just a watch. A very intricate, very expensive, very precise watch. But it's nothing compared to the universe. You know, did the universe just happen? Or was there some kind of design? Now, on the website that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Reasons and Matters, as I was reading through that, here's what one of them said. That he said, this argument has now been disproven by evolution. Because evolution was not by design, it was by chance. So now that we have proven that evolution is a fact, this disproves this argument. I think you've got to have some faith in that. And I know people that believe theistic evolution and people believe 7 days. We're not going to get into that argument today. But at least the people that believe in theistic evolution, they do believe there was a God that started the process rolling. There was a design. Yes?
I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No.
But sometimes they'll reply with what they call bad design, and it does turn out that certain things after the fact we do find, like junk DNA supposedly has a purpose, such that the development of science actually proved that further design, or there was a design after all. The notion, let's see, by design, also, I think the argument is really meant to prove that on balance, that the world, it's not that perfectly everything in the universe has a design aspect, as in the fall cause some things to have that what would from human eyes looks like bad design or is bad design. But their interpretation doesn't take account for the fall, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yes. Okay, anyone, Andy?
There's also, you can couple with design, you can couple maintenance. I think it's important to couple design and maintenance of what has been designed. The scientists call this, like the tilt of the earth issue, for example, which you mentioned. Critical variables kept within critical limits, which is to go back to the premise of that if the sun were this much closer, we'd all fry and just the earth would incinerate, and if it were that much further away, the same distance, further away, the earth would freeze.
Yes.
And somehow but it doesn't do either one of those things. It just stays there. And so there's the creation of it, but then there's the maintenance of it. What holds it all in check? I think that's a good thing to partner with the design demands of designer, not just the creation of it, but also the maintenance of it.
Okay. Any other comments?
And you mentioned this, but the notion to fine-tune the universe, there was
Yes.
something like 131 different characteristics that if we are kind of based on the edge of a needle in that sense, or an edge of like a thread, that if we tilted either way on either of those 131 areas, that we basically couldn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Which further, the very notion of science actually, so there's the notion of the God of the gaps, that we're increasingly showing God to be less and less necessary, the more and more science occurs. But in fact, it's actually the opposite. The more that science proves that there are principles or laws, every conclusion in a scientific study, or when you develop a theory, some Nobel Prize winner wins a prize for whatever scientific discovery they've made, they're actually proving the need or the evidence that there is design in the universe, i.e. every study points to some sort of underlying design. The very notion of the university, in fact, points in that direction as well. We need that stability that the logos provides, that underlying logic of the universe, for us to even have the ability to have libraries that mean anything, or have for human growth, or for human development in terms of the university to make sense. You have to have an underlying order there, that underlying logos for it to make sense.
Okay. And I've heard the argument be made that the more man learns, the more that we can understand that man is superior to any God that we could come up with. But to me, that's another proof. God designed us with the ability to learn things that, we know things today that people couldn't even comprehend 10 or 20 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And I'm sure the same thing is going to be true 10 years from now and 20 years from now, because the amount of knowledge, I can't remember how fast it's doubling, but it's amazing how fast intellect and knowledge of what we know about science and other things. But to me, that's not a proof there's not a God. That's proof there is a God. God created man with the ability to discover these things. And God set forth a world with an order where these things could be discovered, because they're there. There are laws and principles that are there, as you just mentioned. When I saw this about evolution, it reminded me of something, I think I'm pretty good on time, reminded me of something that happened when I was a sophomore in high school. I took biology as a sophomore, and we had a unit on the origins of life. And our teacher presented to us the theory of evolution. That was the first time I'd been exposed to it in a classroom. I'd heard about it at church. Our youth group had gone over some things. But I had a teacher that I respected, that I had a lot of respect for, that was a great teacher, and she was presenting this to us. The day after we finished the unit, we'd had the test. Miss Walker walked into class, and she said, "I have just completed with you the unit on the origins of life, and I fulfill my duties that are given to me by the State Department of Education in Tennessee to teach the standards about the beginnings of life." But she said, "Before we move on, there's one other theory that a lot of people believe, and I just think you need to be aware of this." And she opened the Bible and she read Genesis 1 to us. And then she closed her Bible and she said, "That happens to be what I believe." The class. I don't think you could get by with that and keep a job in the public school today, but back in 1977, you could do that. But the class, it was just like there were so many kids in class that just had the big smile on their face when she said, "And that's what I believe." So I really, really respected her for doing that. Okay, this next one's a tough one for me. I remember I was first exposed to these arguments, I guess, when I was a senior at Hardeman. I took a philosophy class that Ralph Gilmore taught, and we went over these. And this was his first class out of getting his doctorate, so he was tough that year. But this one never did resonate with me, but let's talk about the ontological argument. Kind of sums up God is a necessary being. And here's how this one goes. First of all, let's look at a verse. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Can someone turn to Isaiah 55, 8 and 9?
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts.
Okay, the premise behind this argument, I think it's upheld in Scripture, and those are two good verses about it. We can't comprehend what God knows, and we can't see the things in the way that God sees them. Lots of examples in Job when God is talking with Job that kind of have the same idea, the same meaning. But here is a definition or a summary of this argument, and I found this from the same website, Reason and Matters. It says, number one, God is perfect. Number two, existence is a perfection. Number three, therefore God exists. Or another version is, if the universe has to be contingent on something, and that's just by necessity. A universe has to depend on something else. And that something must be God. Now, the website that I looked at, it just tore this argument way up. It had lots of reasons why this was a good one. And this is an argument that's hard for me to wrap my mind around, even though I understand God knows more than we do. It's just kind of a difficult one for me to grasp. But does anybody have any insight on the ontological argument or any thoughts on that? It would not be my go-to thing if I was going to talk to somebody, but yeah.
Do you remember what they said? I've not seen that website. Like, just generally speaking, a couple of things that they tried to utilize.
Okay. It said this argument has limitations, and it said if you're going to take it to the extreme, just like using the word perfect is one thing they went on because, kind of like you mentioned a minute ago, the world's not perfect. There are things that happen in the world, like we've got a pandemic right now that shows the world's not perfect, that there are bad things that happen. But they said if you're going to take this to the ultimate, then you can be able to say there's a perfect island somewhere, there's a perfect mountain somewhere, there's a perfect this or that. And they say we all know that doesn't happen. So this argument is just not true. The conclusion is that a perfect thing being would be like that you coming up with the concept of what a perfect thing being like doesn't mean one actually exists. That us coming up with the concept that we have a perfect world and therefore there must be a perfect creator, just because you think that doesn't mean a perfect creator actually exists. So that was kind of the route they took on that. All right, there's one other one. This is the moral argument. Would someone turn to Romans 2, verses 14 and 15? The moral argument is that the existence of right and wrong points toward there being a higher power somewhere. If we have right and wrong, there's a higher power somewhere. Does anybody have those two verses to read? Or three verses? No, two verses.
For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse and even excuse.
All right. Even in societies where there's no belief in Christianity or no belief in God, there's usually a standard of right and wrong, and what's accepted is right and wrong. And that's one of the things Paul was alluding to here with the Gentiles, that just by nature, they had come up with a standard of right and wrong. And they did it apart from the law. Now, the law, if you go back to the law of Moses, that tells you the reason for things being right and wrong, because God has established those standards. So there would get to be an argument, well, where do standards come from? Now, there are a lot of people that don't believe in absolutes, unless it's something that's important to them, then they may have absolutes. I never had the courage to do this with the professor I talked about. I remember Tom Holland talking about being in a class when a professor was making the point that there are no absolutes, and Tom raised his hand and said, are you absolutely sure about that? I never had the courage to do that to my teacher, but I think that's a pretty good point. But just to have civilization, you need some absolutes. And I think we can look around the world over things in the last few years and we can see some problems that are arising and have arisen and probably will continue to rise because there are people that don't believe there's a right and wrong in some instances. Or, my truth. I get tired of hearing that concept. My truth is this. Well, it's not my truth or your truth. It's either truth or it's not. Now, if it's a matter of opinion, that's different. But if it's something that's absolute, there's a truth and there's a falsehood. But that's not really the way society wants to go today. Yes?
I think Lewis's example, or C.S. Lewis's example for here is pretty good. He's like, even our basic board games require, or any sort of exchange between people requires a certain notion of fairness for it to establish. I even argue it has some notion of truth as well. So, for instance, I mean, if you cheat at Monopoly, or again, I'm saying the underlying principle is you also shouldn't lie in Monopoly or whatever. But yeah, that's fundamental to how humans operate. Like morality is always a two-way street, and relationship and community is always a two-way street too.
Correct.
The other thing that I think that can be explained, and all societies have a notion of sacred and taboo, so such that there's always a sense in which we in fact need a notion of sacred and taboo. Otherwise, everything becomes just dust. Without a notion of the sacred, we're just dust. We can't prioritize even. We couldn't, like, without some notion of the sacred, we couldn't make a determination between toxic waste and food that we're required to live on a day-by-day basis. But that notion of the sacred is important. I think the notion of developing further and historically, I think arguments that have historical context helps. I think the natural law argument that Martin Luther King makes in terms of civil disobedience makes a lot of sense because it explains the difference between, in a tangible way, that what would be called positive law just means law that exists has to be a counter to some higher law, some higher principle, and without that, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement. Without that, we wouldn't have had all the advancements. Not only in our Constitution similarly relies on this notion of natural law, that notion of God-given law that is sort of inherent in the universe. That's again that kind of harkening back to that logos. And so human power can be abused all over the place. The only way to bring accountability to that power is some sort of transcendent natural law to bring it into being. And you can even say that natural law is based on Imago Dei or whatever, which I think sort of provides it with explains what its ultimate purpose is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So if you look at standards of right and wrong, and that is where there's, no pun intended, whether it's right or wrong to have those standards. I mean, there are evolving things that may be considered wrong now may not have been considered wrong 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 100 years ago, and things that were accepted 100 years ago may totally be unaccepted in society now. And some of those are matters of opinion. Some of them, it might, for example, slavery. Slavery was accepted in our nation 160, 170 years ago, 200 years ago. No way we would tolerate it today because hopefully we've advanced and we've learned more. Now, there was laws of God put in place, and I think the slavery that existed in our nation may not be exactly like the slavery that we read about in the Bible. Maybe in some instances it was. But even though societies change, that doesn't make the fact that there is a God, that there's a standard of right and wrong. And I'm not saying this at all like I meant to say this. But there's got to be some point where that standard came from. And that's where you've got to get to. If you don't believe in God, where did that standard come from? One of the things I read said, and I can't remember what website it's on, but the problem with it, if you're not a believer in God with moral standards, is that the majority of people can come along anytime they want to and change the standard, and there's nobody to say if it's right or wrong. Well, I think we're seeing that in our world. And I think that's probably been true in history throughout civilization. But it is a problem when there's no standard of right and wrong. Andy?
And wherever the line is different with some people on basic moral standard of right and wrong in a society.
Yes.
Wherever the line is, and whenever and however and why a line moves through generations, how that line is moved. At some point, for this person, the line's back here. For this person, the line's a little further up. This person's line's a little further up. But at some point, there's a line
Yes.
that nobody wants to live under. They recognize it as, no, that would not be right. No, that would be terrible. Where did that come from? What does Scripture say? We are made in the image of God.
Yes.
There's a reason that at some point everybody gets to a line and go, okay, no, I got to go. Now that's where we got to draw the line right there. There's a reason. It's where it comes from.
Okay. Our time is about up, but I kind of think in conclusion on this one, if you're a believer in God, it's easy to find out where that line is and where the line came from. If you're not a believer in God, then that line is very subjective, and it's okay for it to change. Kind of gets into there are no absolutes. It's okay if the majority of people say it's okay, it's okay. And I may move somewhere else or 10 years down the line, something that was okay 10 years ago may be wrong now or vice versa. There's going to be an ever-changing definition of what's right and wrong if you don't have some kind of moral compass. And for Christians, that moral compass is God and His Word. For those that aren't Christians, it's an ever-changing thing, and it's got to lead to a chaotic world. Okay, I don't think we'll have class next week. Is that right? Probably the next 2 weeks?
Next 2 weeks, everybody's in the auditorium.
Okay, and then we'll be back here in January. All right, thank you for your attendance tonight. Appreciate it.